You are listening to the Enormocast.
Squama by Sportiva. A shoe for climbers who are not afraid to ascend. Climbing obsession.
Why are you so obsessed?
Squama. Squama vegan. Precision. Stability. Squama vegan. Skin-like.
Why are you so obsessed?
What would you do for the send?
What would you do for the send?
Squama by Sportiva. Squama.
What would you do for the send?
Elevate your sending with the Squama, and elevate your consciousness with the Squama Vegan. All the sending without the animal-derived materials. Find the Squama at Sportiva.com or your favorite local shop. Squama.
What would you do for the send?
Oh my God, Janice. You know what I like about winter in the mountains? It's puffy weather.
Puffy weather?
That's what I said, puffy weather. You know, the time to cuddle down in your puffy, no matter where or when. But what if your puffy is some sort of overworked, filthy, greasy rag? Like you've been hanging out in front of the fryer at Long John Silver's. That doesn't sound like the kind of puffy for puffy weather.
More like dirtbag puffy weather.
Well, if you need a new puffy, Black Diamond has you covered like glitter on the prom queen.
Literally, covered in puffy.
First, there's the Vision Down Parka. The puffiest puffy for puffy weather ever. Warmer than your dear mother's hug. By the way, call your mother, she misses you.
She gave you life. Call your mother.
Do you want to layer your puffy? Maybe over a sweater? Then look no further than the Approach Down hoodie. Stash it away until it's puffy weather for real.
What about the Access Down hoodie? It's perfect for puffy weather that's on the cusp of sweater weather but could be puffy weather in an instant. I never leave home without my puffy, honey.
Check out BlackDiamondEquipment.com or your favorite local shop for the warmest, snuggliest puffies around. Oh my God! Who else loves puffy weather?
Listen, where are you playing in town? Are you playing here?
We're doing the Enormo Dome, whatever it is. It's terrific.
Oh,
It's
yeah,
a
the big place, that side of town. That's a big
nice.
place. You sold it out. I'll see.
You really should.
The hell are you doing? I couldn't sleep. I'm checking the ropes. There was a frayed end on your rope, and I'm cutting it out.
Good weather, bad weather. Now or later, anytime, good time.
Today's show is brought to you by Black Diamond Equipment, La Sportiva, and with support from Maxim Ropes. Maxim has been keeping the Enormocast off the deck since 2012.
And now, we can also thank the chill folks at Yeti. And don't forget our charter sponsor, Bonfire Coffee. Go to bonfirecoffee.com and enter Enormo at checkout to get a great deal on great coffee and to support the Enormocast.
And now back to the show.
Hello and welcome to the Enormocast. This is your host, Chris Galus. It is January 15th, 2024, about 10 p.m. here in Colorado, and this is episode 278 of the Enormocast. A conversation with alpinist Thomas Bukowski, also known as Neo Dude on Instagram. Isn't it weird how, the Instagram handles are starting to supplant people's names altogether? I think I first really noticed that with Trad Princess. I don't really know who that was until I interviewed her. And I think Neo Dude's a little bit the same. I didn't really know what his name was until I started to think about interviewing him, got the recommendations from a couple people. Then I had to look up his name, even though I knew a lot about him just by watching his Instagram. So anyway, Neo Dude on Instagram too. All right, but before we get that, there's a couple important pieces of business. First of all, you Enormocast fans, listeners, know what happens around the beginning of the year. Never the first episode of the year. Never. Often the third, fourth episode of the year, actually, is the Taps episode. It's coming up. We're making it. But last year, I thought about tapsing the Taps episode, but then that was one of my highest downloading episodes of the year. So we're going for it. You guys love it. Can't get enough of it. Saltiness actually is pretty popular on the internet, turns out. But what I'd like to do this year, and I need your participation again. Last year we had a mostly listener mail one. But how about some voicemails? Would you guys be willing to call in with some voicemails with your Taps suggestions? And if anybody's listening to this for the first time and don't know what Taps is, well, we'll kind of get to it here in a sec. But those of you who know and are chomping at the bit to get something submitted, let's try doing voicemails. You got to come through for me. So I have an 800 number. I bought an 800 number. It's actually really inexpensive to get an 800 number, which is why I think there's so many fucking scams going on around the world. But I have an 800 number. So if you want to leave a voicemail with your Taps ideas, please don't hesitate. Call 1-888-532-9822. That's 888-532-9822. No, it doesn't spell anything. I thought about getting an Enormo one, but that costs extra, and I'm probably going to get rid of this after this month because I don't need an 800 number for anything else. I'm not keeping it to next year. I'll just get a new one because it's so cheap. Get an 800 number if you want one. Anyway, call that number, or if you didn't write it down or you're driving or something like that, you can go to enormocast.com. The phone number is on the first post up there. It's pinned to the top. I'll probably post it on Instagram too. That's usually the most effective way. Anyway, remember, Taps are trends, ideas, things in climbing we wish, A, would go away. That's everybody's favorite one. They have their salty hobby horse they want done away with, like shitty crag dogs or shitty crag dog owners. And then the next one, and this is actually my favorite one, favorite category. This is actually kind of how I started the Taps thing. It wasn't just a bitch fest at the beginning. Are trends that are dying that we kind of wish weren't dying. I think traditions that are going away would be a good way to put it, that are dying on the vine out of neglect. One of them that I constantly think about is the onsite. I don't think the onsite means what it used to mean. I think the flash and the onsite continue to get melded together into one thing. You can't belay your buddy and then onsite the route, unless you did like the old Frenchies used to do, which was turn away, not watch. They just belayed with their back to the wall, which sounds sketchy, but back in the day, if you used to see Frenchies belaying with like a cigarette in one hand and like just tossing rope through a loose figure eight while just spraying French gibberish at anybody who would listen, they were always pretty sketchy, but they survived somehow. And then finally, the zombies. The zombies are the ones that we all agree should go away. Like 99.9% of us think these things should go away, but they just hang on. You know, I think the unsolicited beta bro is one of those things. Even that guy doesn't like it when it happens to him, but he can't help himself at the gym. Just like, yeah, you should have grabbed that thing on. Yeah, try it on like this. Anyway, we all know that's lame. So those are the categories. Call 1-888-532-9822. You fucking Canadians, you can call too, actually. The Europeans, I don't think you can. But if you send me an email, I'll accept it if you got something. European perspective would be interesting. If you send a good one, we'll play it on the show. So try to talk clearly, be concise. Leave your name and address so I can send you a prize, but we won't use your full name on the show. And if you really need me to disguise your voice or something,
which I can,
then, tell me that or whatever. If you're really fucking going after something, that'll be good. If you got something on there you need to disguise your voice for, we'll probably use it. All right, second piece of business. This intro's getting long. Indulge me. My friend and friend of the show, Eric Barnard, up there in Winona, Minnesota, has organized an ice climbing festival. And I want to tell you about it real quick. I'll probably go to it next year. We're already talking about that. I'm going to Michigan this year. Anyway, Eric created an ice park there in Winona, Minnesota, also known as Boulder on the Mississippi. And they've got an ice fest going on this year, the fledgling one. Okay, the first ice fest. February 22nd to the 25th, 2024. So go to BigRiverClimbingGuides.com. That's where the Winona, Minnesota Ice Fest information resides. Of course, just Google Winona Ice Fest and it comes up. That's what I just did. It's a cool little town. They got an ice park that Eric created and should be fun. You know, you can be like the early adopter. You can be like one of those people who saw the B-52s in somebody's basement in Athens. You know what I'm saying? Before it all went down. You were there in the front row of the basement getting spit on by Fred. Go to the first one. I'm not doing that. It's like when they come out with the first model of a car, you don't want to buy that one. You want to buy like the next year when they've worked out some of the kinks. So I'll be there probably next year, 2025. Because why wouldn't I? Fuck, it sounds fun. And you know I love ice climbing. Okay, on to Thomas Bukowski. Thomas Bukowski, a.k.a. Neo Dude, is an alpinist, a rock climber. He also happens to be half Chinese, grew up in Hong Kong. How he got the name Bukowski, well, simply had a German father. He's on the North Face athlete development team, which is clearly North Face's push to diversify its athlete roster. And how does Thomas Bukowski diversify North Face's athlete roster? Well, Thomas Bukowski is openly gay. And I say openly gay because I think that's pretty rare in alpinism. I mean, Thomas and I both feel like it's pretty rare, and he's out there doing it. Of course, a lot of queer people don't necessarily want that to be the flag they're always flying, no matter what they're doing. They might want to just go climbing without that being the first thing people want to talk about. However, for Thomas, it's something that he's doing. It's something that he's bringing to climbing. He does want to spend his career promoting affinity spaces for gay climbers, for underserved communities, and be that activist that's bringing climbing to where it hasn't really been before. But he also happens to be a really good climber. So we catch him in a van in Yosemite, pretty classic. He had just finished doing 3 El Cap routes in 3 days, and it was sort of in between him blasting off to Patagonia. So this guy has a bright future and an interesting perspective. I hope you enjoy it. The first new episode of 2024 with Thomas Bukowski.
I think it would be cool to like maybe at the start like go through sort of my background a little bit, because it is kind of, I think I do have a little bit of like a funny sort of both a funny path to climbing, but also just a funny little life so far. And
you just named the interview.
There you go. My funny little life.
Funny little life.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But, yeah.
There's several things that make you unique, and one of them is where you came from. So we'll get to there. But can we open with just talking about current events? Because I made a joke this morning about like, I hope this isn't interrupting a fourth big wall. So you just got done with a tear on El Cap. So let's just open with that, because
sure,
you know, we're a climbing podcast. You're a climber, and you've been climbing some pitches. So tell me a little bit about your little run of the last week or so.
Yeah, I was kind of trying to find something. I'm just like not fast enough to do the Triple Crown in Yosemite. So I was like, cool, like what can I do? That would be like a cool challenge. I think originally the idea was it would be good training for Patagonia, was my thought. I was like, oh, like Patagonia, going out for like 2, 3, 4 days, and you're just kind of doing these massive days back to back. And I was like, well, maybe like just climb El Cap a bunch of times would be a good way to train for that. So I ended up doing three routes in 3 days, just like every day, go do a route on El Cap and come back down and eat and sleep. And I think the cool thing about it also that I really like is that it's, if you do some kind of mega link up, it's like you start and you're basically like, okay, I'm just going to hold on tight until I finish. And then when you finish the climb, you're like, cool, I'm done. Like, you know, it's over. But then by kind of coming down every day and like eating and then being back in the van and then being like, okay, got to go again next day. And you have the opportunity to kind of try and recover and put on the hand creams you need or whatever it is. It's kind of like, it makes it more into kind of like a 3-day long thing where you got to pay attention to more than just the climbing and how quickly you're climbing. You'll be like, okay, well, I actually don't want to climb too fast, because then I'll get, you know, that'll hose me for like, you know, the second or the third day. And the recovery becomes really important, and just kind of it's a more holistic challenge than just like okay, start the clock at the bottom of the mountain and just climb as quickly as possible to the top of the mountain. Let's see. We ended up doing South the first day, which was harder than expected, and then the nose, and then Lurking Fury the last day.
Yeah,
classic.
Who did you have different partners, or did you hook up with?
Yeah,
is it
no?
one partner?
I climbed with Hayden Jameson the first day, and then my friend Sam Stuckey came in for day 2 and 3. Yeah,
cool.
I kind of struggled with that a little bit. It would have been cool to do with one person, but it was also, I don't know, in these like sort of deep sufferfests, sometimes it's nice also to be like, okay, you're kind of in your own world. Maybe I kind of come a little bit from like the outrunning world where you're like very much, I'm on this journey alone. So like it was nice to kind of be like, okay, cool. Well, you know, to have someone fresh, especially with day 2, and kind of just be like, all right, you know, I'm going to be a little slow and a little creaky, but sort of being able to sort of live in that world in my own brain was kind of nice.
Opening with the South Day, and that thing's really physical. You know, I mean, however really you're doing it, whether you're free climbing as much as you can, squirming, because there's a ton of big, wide bits on that route. Yeah, just all the squirming on the 10s, I mean, even like the 7, yeah, and off that bivvy on top of the half flake, that next pitch is like physical. It's all physical. It's like it's
real
pretty
physical.
wild. Every pitch, I feel like every pitch has like almost has a squirm on it. You know?
Yeah, and it's like real steep, and also just like I think someone was working the theory, the going theory is that someone was working the head wall, so it was like really stripped of fixed gear. So I think the only fall any of us took the 3 days was me whipping off of like a cam. It's like really like shot my nerves for maybe like a day and a half, really. But like I was just like, wow, this was terrifying. And then I like do some like beak hooking on like dead heads, which I'd like never really done before, and I was just like not that much of like an aid climber. It was just a very like, it was kind of this moment where I was like, oh, I could bail. So then I ended up doing like 2 3/4. What do I do with my life if I bail now? I was like, it's like, oh God. Like, so it took a little, I was just like throw myself in the Merced, I guess, but it took a little while to like, get through it sort of mentally. And then I just did it and it was fine. But you know, the mental part was just like, I like put my head in my arms, just like, it was like amazing. I was like on the side of the head where it's like, you know, 2,000 feet of air below me. It's like the sun is setting. It's like gorgeous, like golden hour. And I'm just like head in my arms being like, what have I done? Why am I here?
Right.
I made a huge
mistake. That's so funny. Yeah, it's great to hear you struggle with all the same shit everybody does. Cause I mean, that whole thing of like, I've set this project for myself. And if I'm unable to do it, I'm like worthless. It's like, this is my whole future hinges on like, am I going to send my project? And then the other funny thing I thought was, oh, I'm going to do this thing that like, you know, most climbers would be like a crowning achievement, but I'm doing it as training for this other thing in the future. You know, everything's training for the next thing.
It's all training.
So that's a pretty classic thing. Yeah.
I mean, not that it super matters if like other people have done it or not before, but you know, I don't think it's something that's super commonly done. The 3-peat is, I think, the name that stuck for it. But yeah, I don't think it's super commonly done. Probably for good reason. It's like, you know, it's sort of on the more masochistic side of things. But yeah, no, it was super fun. And it's like, I don't know, it's something that's very much up my alley. Just, it works well with my brain and my personality. Yeah. So I was stoked. It was a great time.
Well, congratulations. It's an awesome accomplishment, and hopefully it will serve you well when you're grinding it out somewhere on hour 36 on some alpine route. But I need to ask you because you're like I'm going to make you sort of my reporter on the scene. Have you run into these cats that just freed the nose?
I don't think so. No.
Alex Waterhouse and Billy Riddle.
No, I don't think I ran into them. Yeah, they're like comp climbers, but then also like
they were, yeah.
It's like
that's like the storyline is they're like retired comp climbers that have never big well climbed and they just freed the nose. And I can't tell how old they are, but they look like kids to me. But that doesn't mean they're not in their like late 20s.
Totally,
to be honest. But so anyway, I was just curious because it's like it sort of is blown up a little bit on the internet that, you know, and that's the line is that they basically like, you know, stopped grabbing giant volumes and went up and did the nose immediately. Although there was a lot of work put in. So I was curious.
Well, it's not so different.
If
it's
you were
also
aware of those guys.
Slippery slopers, right? It's kind of in a vague way, similar kinds of climbing. No.
So I mean, it's
those
a super
guys.
Cool story.
We did run into 3 parties of Japanese climbers. It was 2 parties on the South Day. that were trying to free the South, and then so maybe they meant free rider, unsure, but like maybe there's there's always a bit of a language barrier there. And then on the third day, Lurking Fear ran to these two guys that were also trying to free. They were like working the Lurking Fear pitches, and it's just like, whoa. I don't feel like I've never heard of anyone even trying to free Lurking Fear. Legend has it that all the hauling that's gone on, it has like sort of blown off a lot of the edges that Tommy and Beth used back in 2000. Was it 2000 when it got free?
Right.
But yeah, like I was just like, whoa, like there's so much free climbing. There's like 3 or 4 parties in El Nino. It's like there's so much free climbing happening at El Cap. It's just mind blowing.
Yeah, the El Nino seems like it got hip. So yeah, it's funny because it's just all my Instagram. It's like that's all I know. That's how I know everything's happening.
Right.
So revolution of people being able to, like average Joes, being able to step up to that level, I think is where we're at these days. You don't have to be the top anymore to go up there and have a really good shot at it. So
yeah, I wonder
it's pretty cool.
What changed? Like, I feel like, is it that like the big wall system got better, or like everyone's just, it's easier now to become a stronger climber because like there's so many more gyms, the gyms are much better, we know what train, like what I think about this a lot because like I don't know, I started climbing the valley like 10 or 12 years ago, and I was like, oh, never, the idea of free climbing El Cap just never even crossed my mind, because it just seemed like it was only people that was like Tommy and Alex and Beth and Lynn Hill, because all these people that are like just absolute legends that would be able to do it. But now it's like freeriders got to be getting freed like 50, 100 times a year now. It's like, so like I wonder what's changed. Like what's changed?
I mean, it's a little bit of everything, but my opinion is always vision. You get a couple average people who do one of those things. I mean, I was sort of one of them. My pre-ascent's a little bit asterisks. But yeah, I mean, you just get a few people and it kind of starts to crack the door and other people find out. And then I think, even I've often said like the Hubers, were kind of blew the doors open. They showed up like 97-ish. And then by like the 2000s, there was quite a few people free climbing. It's not like 5 years, all those people got that much stronger, but they saw this vision and this idea that it could be done. And I think we've just kind of reached maximum, consciousness of like, well, that guy could do it, or that girl could do it, then I can do it. Kind of a thing just starts to build, in my opinion.
So maybe it was just, again, it was mental all along.
Yeah, I know. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Rather than like,
it's always is, right?
Better. It turns out, yeah, I mean, maybe it's funny because I think we focus so much in climbing about like, oh, I need to like train more and hangboard more. And like, how much weight can I do on this and that? Like so much of, I feel like climbing can be focused on that and focused on like being stronger physically, but we almost never, there's more of it now, but it's almost never talk about the mental side. And we talk, there's more about like falling and things like that. I feel there's so many things that are maybe like a lot of us can do, but we just feel like we can't do. And that's definitely my journey or whatever has been definitely it's filled with things. I'm like, well, I never could do that. And I'm like, oh, I did it. So I guess I could do it. Or like, or seeing someone else do it.
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Totally.
Yeah.
Well, it's snowballs, and that's, you have to have a certain amount of audacity. I think that's a hallmark of climbers. And, you have to take those steps. And I can think of 20 ways in my climbing career where I didn't, and I probably should have, and who knows what that would open, because you have both. I mean, you're going to have both in your life and in your climbing and then years later, you're like, I could have done that. Like, why didn't I do that? Like that guy did it, or that girl did it. So I don't know. I think it's all, a lot of it's mental. I mean, you can't just mentally climb like 15C just because there's totally. Like a little more that goes into, it's like, if I just get my mind right, I'll be able to
think about it the right way.
Repeat silence.
The route. Yeah, exactly.
But it's like 12D or whatever the free rider hasn't been cutting edge for a long time. So, and if you took those pitches and put them off the ground at a crag, it's like most really decent climbers could get up them. So yeah, you have to put those parts in. But anyway, let's talk about you. So you're hanging out in your van too. This is a fun one because I can actually see you in your van, and yeah. So it feels a little more authentic. Like we caught you right in the middle of it. That's why I wanted to start with that stuff. I listened to another podcast that you did and looked around the web and kind of figured out a little bit about what to talk about. But I would like to talk about your past, where you came from, because it's fairly unique, especially running into you here in the States, because that's this isn't where you were born. Let me ask you a few questions about that. I mean, you were born in Hong Kong,
No, I was actually born in the States.
Is that correct? I know you grew up there.
No, I was
you were?
born in the
Okay,
States.
yeah,
I was born in
let's fill it in.
Arizona.
Okay.
Yeah, because basically, this is back in the late 80s, I guess. But yeah, my mom wanted me to have my mom's Chinese. She was born in Hong Kong, grew up in Hong Kong, and she wanted me to have an American citizenship because back then it's probably still pretty fashionable to have an American citizenship, but it was like, oh, it's the passport to the world. So she just literally maybe she just wrote a letter to a friend she knew in Arizona and was like, hey, can I just fly over and stay with you for 3 months and then give birth to my child in the US? And that's what she did. It was just crazy. I think about it now. So she was a single mom, I think about it now. It's can you imagine? And she was 40, 41 when she had me, so fairly old, just kind of fully YOLOing across the Pacific and being cool, I'm just going to go to this other country and just have my kid and then fly back to Hong Kong. But that's what she did. And so I was born in the US actually, which is really funny. I mean, I think I spent probably maybe, I don't know, but a week or two here before we all flew back to Hong Kong, whatever sort of post birth things that needed to be done. And, but then otherwise I grew up in Hong Kong, where there's actually pretty good climbing, but I didn't know that until well into climbing in the US. I was like, oh, there's great sea cliffs and cool little trad climbs, and a lot of old volcanic rock in Hong Kong. So it's actually some pretty good climbing. But I never climbed there.
Right. So kind of position us about what growing up in Hong Kong is like, or what it was like for you. I'm sure there's diverse economics and everything else that makes it different for everybody, but compare it to what you know about kids growing up here. What was that like?
I mean, Hong Kong's kind of an interesting place because when I was growing up, it was still a British colony, and it was 97, 9 years old when it got handed back to the Chinese. And back then, there was a lot of kind of talk about how the Hong Kong people are ethnically Chinese, and they feel as part of the same people as the people in China, right? But it's a very different society, it's very different development as a place than China has, in the last 150 years or so. So the Hong Kong's been a British colony. But it was also funny for me because I'm half German, hence the Bukowski for the last name, and half Chinese. And so I had blonde hair when I was a kid. Hong Kong was a place that was kind of split a little bit, right? So this East meets West. It was 99.99% sort of Han Chinese in terms of people, but it had these British rulers. And then I was a mixed child there. We used to go to McDonald's a lot because, I guess we didn't know any better. And, it's back in the 90s. There was one time I was 6 and I went up to the counter to order something by myself. And the person, she spoke to me in English because she thought I was, she thought I didn't know Cantonese. She thought I was an expat or a foreign kid. And I had this moral dilemma. It's my first time I remember having a moral dilemma. Do I reply to her in Cantonese, which would kind of be it's kind of a dig. It's oh, you thought I wasn't, Chinese, but actually I am Chinese. So that's kind of weird. Or do I reply in English, but I know that English would be harder for her to communicate in. And I was just what do I do? Do I which language do I reply in? I think I ended up replying Cantonese, but it was just this funny thing where it's just I was kind of straddling these cultures. And that was, I think, mostly how I grew up. It was kind of this funny thing where I ended up going to private school because my mom, when she was working, she was an English teacher in the local Chinese schools, and they're very strict. Everyone has their own desk and lots of homework, and kind of sort of fits the stereotype of how you imagine Chinese or Asian schooling would be like. And she just kind of knew I was I was kind of the classic kid that I wouldn't sit still, run around all the time, wouldn't do my homework, and very distracted, and so on and so forth. And she was she just knew I wouldn't survive in the local school system. I remember she said, she was oh yeah, we see a couple kids like you every year. It's not their fault. They're just the system is just not built well for them.
Kids the back row kids.
Yeah, and the kids that the kids that won't sit still and always running around, and you're okay, right, that doesn't work well with lots of homework.
Mm-hmm.
And so I ended up going to private school, and she taught me English so I could get into these schools because we didn't speak English at home growing up because we're a Chinese family. Yeah, so it was kind of funny. I was kind of in this in these international schools, as they're called in Hong Kong, and they're a lot of expat kids, some American kids, some local kids, But then I had this very Chinese sort of upbringing at home, but then this sort of fairly international sort of I spoke English every day at school. Sort of that's kind of how my life started, right? I was always kind of straddling sort of these two cultures, and always kind of never quite fitting into one or the other, and always kind of having to bridge, I guess, like the differences between the things, and also the difference of socioeconomic situations, right? Like, I mean, we were kind of like maybe lower middle class growing up. I think being a public school teacher in Hong Kong is a little better off than in the US, but not that much better off. It's still a public teaching job. But a lot of my classmates were like, yeah, folks who were just more wealthy.
You ended up in, eventually in San Francisco,
yeah,
as an adult, and and if I met you, I wouldn't have any idea. I think right away that you grew up speaking Chinese in Hong Kong. So what would you say? Like, so you've incorporated American culture, I'm sure, quite well, and for better and worse, depending on how you look at it. But what remains in you, do you think, like in maybe your personality, the way you do things, from being, a Chinese kid, basically growing up in Hong Kong? Is there anything like personality-wise you're like, oh yeah, that still comes out, or whatever? Or have you just basically shed it? I actually, in something you said, you eviscerated yourself from your culture. You used that word. I don't know if you remember using that, or if if it just came to your mind, or if that word has portents. But
I think that's fair. I think like, I mean, coming to the US, I kind of like had was a kind of immigrant, right? Like I didn't struggle with a lot of the immigration sort of issues and the legal issues because my mom flew over and gave birth to me here. But like, when I moved to the US, I didn't know anyone in the US. And like when I moved up to San Francisco, I was like, I was kind of like, oh, like, maybe I want to move it to San Francisco. And I was like, where is San Francisco? I think there's a bridge. Like I just didn't know very much about the US at all. So like, I think I assimilated a lot, right? I like, as immigrants do. And I think in part of that, you eviscerating, if you will, right? I think I still come off quite, I think maybe a term to describe it is like kind of Asian American, right? I think I'm still like, I tend to be on the quieter side. I tend to not necessarily be someone who's like super loud and takes up a lot of space in that way. Like that's just kind of how that's an aspect of Asian culture, right? And I think a lot of other things to see with me is like, when I dropped out of college, my mom was already like, oh, what are you doing? But like now when I'm like sort of not working and just climbing all the time and living in a van, it's like, it's very hard for her to understand, I think, this. And I think very hard for her to like be like, is it good or bad? Like, are you doing well or not doing well? Like living in a van seems like you're not doing well, So I think a lot of those, right? I mean, it used to be bad living in a van.
It's a nice van, Mom. I mean, it's not just like a Chevy.
Totally. Yeah. But I don't think she really understands, the spectrum of vans out there. But
right.
Yeah, but I think those voices are also still inside me, right? Where I'm kind of like, oh God, maybe I should go get a real job. Maybe like this whole climbing thing is, I think my mom likes to say, oh, you've taken the hobby too seriously, and things like that. And so, yeah, I think those things stay with me. She might, totally. I think that might apply to most people that spend a lot of time climbing, right? But I mean, here we are.
One of the things that plays prominently in your media and I think in your attitudes and your outreach is that you identify as a gay man. Part of what you do are working towards as a guide. I was reading about, this desire to, quote, bring more queer folks into climbing guiding, make climbing more diverse is one of your missions. We here listening in the States, we know about the spectrum of attitudes towards gay men in this country. Did you come out before you left Hong Kong? What are the attitudes like there as far as that?
In Hong Kong, I think it's
growing up gay, basically, is what I'm asking. Yeah.
I don't think I really realized it until it took me like a long time when I was in college in the US. Was when I was like freshman fall. I woke up one morning and I was like, oh, I'm gay. Like I think I knew in some ways, but I didn't have like the label for it for a long time. It was like a very bizarre experience.
Wow.
Yeah, I was like, oh, I see. Like, well, I think it highlights an interesting thing, which is the difference between like sexuality and identity, right? Like I think someone can be like, oh, I'm attracted to the same sex, and like I mostly date and have sex with whatever people of the same sex, but they might not identify with the community and identify with the label in the same way. And that's, so there's a difference actually, I mean, without getting too much into like gender studies. But in Hong Kong, it's kind of has kind of like a don't ask, don't tell sort of vibe to it mostly, where it's like, and people are like, oh, well, that's, that's not great, but people aren't like explicitly homophobic necessarily. recently, I think it's gone to a point where it's like, you're totally cool with like other people's children being gay, but if it's like your own child being gay, you're like, oh no, that's maybe not good. So we're kind of at that stage of the process there. I think unfortunately, like in the last couple of years, since China has kind of, I think, cracked down a little more on civic discourse and free speech and that, and just kind of tightened their grip a little bit on Hong Kong, they have also, I think, discouraged more. It's become less okay politically, like being gay and just like gay culture and community for lots of reasons. But I mean, one of them being that I think China's one-child policy has set them up. It's set them up sort of demographically. They have like very few children now to take care of like a large number of older adults. So they have this whole kind of campaign of like, no, you should have more children now. We want more children to have more workers for the nation, And so if you're gay, then it's like, oh well, you're probably not going to have kids, so that's bad because then you're not supporting this like national cause to have more children. Yeah, so I think that actually has made it worse to be gay, to be queer, and to be kind of like not sort of nuclear family, sort of like normative family structures in Hong Kong. So sometimes things move forward, sometimes things take a step back.
The climbing podcast question is, where did climbing come into all this? You said you weren't when you were in Hong Kong. Was it something that you found filming? It was
boarding school in Norway.
Okay, you went to boarding school in Norway.
Yeah.
Is that when did climbing show up?
Yeah,
Well, and there's also what before we get to that, like there is an interesting thing is that so many people who come on this show were the squirrely kid who couldn't sit still.
Totally.
Both men and women that come on this show. So it's like it fits that suddenly there was this thing that we're being the energy filled squirrely kid paid off, if you will, if you're a climber.
Yeah, totally.
So anyway,
in
sorry
that way,
to interrupt, but go back to learning it.
No, it's nice to fit. It's nice to fit into that stereotype for sure. Yeah, I was ended up going to boarding school in Norway, and it was kind of like a school that was like everyone was on scholarship. They were trying to bring together as many sort of cultures and countries as possible. So like in my 100-person class, there were 44 nationalities. So it was like also a very crazy experience and like very life-changing and very interesting. But at that school, I ended up becoming pretty good friends with the physics teacher. And he turned out to be this Chris Hamper, one of the strongest climbers in Britain in like the 80s, Sheffield and things like that. Like there's like these old guidebooks of him like putting up like the first 13A in Sheffield or something like that, and so he kind of like any self-respecting climber, he like, got married, had like 3 kids, settled down in Norway, teaching at the school. He just like went to like a local wall and just scrubbed the crap out of it and bolted it. And now you have some climbing, next to your house. That was how I started climbing. I started climbing outside on this like wall that was like scrubbed. There's like, remember there was like one like 5'9" with like a really bouldery move that was like super hard and kind of close to the ground. And there was like this 10D that like was everyone's like first project. Like everyone was like just, you're like, okay, we got the 5'9", so now you try to lead the 10D and it's like super scary and and I think I projected that thing for like 7 or 8 months. I just go every other week or a week and just go and throw myself at that thing. I was maybe like 17, and that was how I started climbing. It was very random.
It's funny how it seems random, but there was some outlet that was needed and could have gone a bunch of different places, but you took to it. Did you pretty quickly start thinking about like my future, or where am I going to live so I can keep doing this? Like what were your vibes as you moved on? No,
not really. So I finished school there, and then I ended up going to college in the East Coast. I went to college at Dartmouth for 2 years in New Hampshire. So I ended up climbing in Rumney a bunch, and I also had a really good mentor there. And I think I went down to the Gunks once to like trad climb, and was kind of just like, what are all these widgets? And then I ended up dropping out of college. And when I dropped out of college, I had been sort of programming computers since I was like pretty young, like 10 or 11. And when I dropped out of college, I was like, well, I guess I need to get a job because I don't want to move back to Hong Kong. So it's like between like New York and San Francisco. And I was like, oh, San Francisco, they do computer stuff there, and they do, they have gay people there. And I was like, sounds great, So that's how I ended up moving to San Francisco. And I ended up just looking on Craigslist, found a place to live. And it happened to be 2 blocks from the climbing gym. And I think back then, just like climbing wasn't I really liked it, but it just, I didn't really have space to be really obsessed with it. Like I just had so little, like I was like just trying to like get my life established and like make some money so I could pay rent, like figure out how to cook pasta. Like it was just so much like more like urgent things to deal with. That I was like, oh yeah, climbing's fun. That's a fun thing to do. But like yeah, it was just like so many other things I had to sort of focus on first. But it was crazy. Yeah, I like moved to this place in the Mission. It was just like, oh, thank God someone wants to live with me. Great. And I just like, cool. Now I have somewhere to live. And then I like half a year later, I was like, oh, I'm 2 blocks from Mission Cliffs. I like didn't even know because I was just like too busy with non-climbing life stuff. It's like such a classic story. I like went, I like had a friend I met in the gym. We're like, oh, we're going to Yosemite. Do you want to come? And I was like, yeah, sounds great. I heard there's great climbing in Yosemite. No idea where Yosemite was. Didn't know how to drive. Didn't have a car. So it was kind of like, didn't have a trad rack. And I showed up in Yosemite and I was like, oh no, it's all trad. And I was like, I guess I need to learn how to trad climb crap, you know? And so that was kind of how it all started. But yeah, I could have moved to New York City instead, and I probably would have maybe never really gotten more into climbing. But it was just sort of one thing led to another, and I was like, oh, I guess here I'm in. I guess I need to learn how to drive so I can drive to Yosemite so I can climb. And now climbing's completely taken over my life.
It's fascinating because it's like I see these little markers in your progression, and I want them to be, you know, like I dropped out of college to go climbing, or I did this to go climbing, but it's not like that. Is there a story worth mentioning about dropping out of Dartmouth?
I think it wasn't a great social environment for me. They probably would really dislike this characterization, but I kind of like to say that like Dartmouth is where like people like Brett Kavanaugh sort of get made. They like really like beer, and they're like kind of have questionable sort of like behavior towards women, and just generally are kind of like really weirdly entitled and kind of just like really aggressive. And you're just like, oh God, you know? Yeah, so Dartmouth was, I think, socially not a great environment for me. And I mean, it's an amazing school, but I just wasn't doing very well. And it was kind of like one of those things where I was like, maybe I should take a break, you know? It was definitely a very difficult period. I was also like moving to the US, and I was like, didn't know anyone, and like everything was so, like I had a bigger cultural shock going from Norway to the US than going from Hong Kong to Norway. Somehow. It was just, yeah. I mean, the US is just, I found it a very overwhelming place to move to. Like, I remember like the first time I went to like a Kmart, it was just like, wow, how is there a building that's this big with this much stuff in it? And I was just like, I basically had like a mini panic attack. I was like, I don't know what to do. Everything is so expensive here. Like, oh my God, like, do I need a bicycle? Maybe I do need a bicycle, but it's like $100. It's like, that is so much money, you know, in Hong Kong dollars and so on and so forth. But
yeah, that's fascinating. If you thought $100 was a lot of money, then yeah, Dartmouth must have been a really weird place for you.
It was a very weird place. Yeah,
I don't think a lot of the people there concern themselves with a $100 bicycle. But yeah, that's interesting. But then you didn't, you know, you went to San Francisco, and it wasn't like I'm going to find a new place to finish my collegiate experience. You just decided to drop into the workforce. And but let me ask you one other thing. You sort of casually mentioned waking up one morning and realizing you were gay. Is pretty much exactly how you put it. I mean, did that, you know, was that revelation cause any consternation for you? Did you embrace it? Because I mean, when you're talking about, and I heard you say this elsewhere too, like, oh yeah, I decided to go to San Francisco because I heard there were gay people there. Like, it seems very casual, like you sort of incorporated it and basically embraced the identity. But did that really happen that way?
I think more or less. I think for me, like just personally, I think being gay has always been this kind of like, it's like this curiosity, right? And I think it's not so different from anyone's, you know, when you like maybe, you know, see someone across the bar, and you're kind of like, oh, that person looks, you're kind of like interested, right? And like that's, and regardless of gender or whatever, like I think attraction is this thing that kind of is this, in a way, like you can describe as like a private curiosity, right? You're like, oh, what's going on there? I would like to investigate further. And I think that's always kind of how it's felt to me. I think looking back, I think there was a lot of like struggle inside in terms of how to make sense of it. But I think at the end of the day, I was kind of just like, oh, like, well, now that I have a word for it, I can go find other people and places which have the same word. And I think it was always one of those things like, oh, I should like spend a little time on this gay thing, you know? I shouldn't like just kind of put it aside. I should like factor it into my decision making for like where to live or whatever. I think that was, at least back then when I was like 20, that was kind of how I thought about it. And I mean, I'm really glad I did. I think it's like, if you want to kind of like figure out yourself, you know, as a gay person, as a queer person, like in your early 20s, like moving to San Francisco is probably one of the best places in the world to do that. So that like, that little bit of kind of like, oh, they have gay people there, worked out pretty well for me. And I'm like really glad I did that, because I think it's funny these days. I spend so little time in cities now, right? Because I'm living the van, trying to climb as much as I can and things like that. And like, it's almost like a reverse, like it's almost like I'm going back in the closet, because I'm just like, well, just depending on where I am, some places I feel is more scary to like be openly gay or to have like pink hair or whatever it is, to be like, oh no, these pants are a little too tight maybe for Wyoming. But like most of the time I don't feel
they like tight pants as long as they say Wrangler on them.
Make some fashion shifts here. But but it's like most of the time I don't feel like afraid to be gay, but I'm also like surrounded, like I'm never like in, like maybe sometimes there's like one other person that's gay or queer and I'm like, oh, that's great, but it's not like I'm never in a community of queer people,
right?
And it's like a way of going back in the closet, because it's like, well, it's like it's something that I like never really talk about, and like no one really will understand in the way where like they also have the same lived experiences, right? And so it's just this thing where it's I don't know. I think it's really been a sort of very central struggle where I'm just like, but it's also like a very silent struggle, right? Because I'm like, well, I'm still climbing a ton, and that's great, but there's this thing that like once again is kind of like sort of in the background, and like I wish I could like spend more time on it, but like now spending more time on it is like, oh, let me try and van life in San Francisco, which is like not so appealing, and so it's tricky. It's been a very tricky experience for sure.
Yeah, that's a fascinating way to look at like sort of like returning a little bit to the closet. I mean, not pretending that you're not gay or not telling people or whatever, but it probably does feel like that in that climbing world.
One way that I think about these identities these days I really like is, there's some identities you can't hide. Like if you have dark colored skin or you like have a very visible disability, like you can't hide that. Like there's no way to hide it. So the response to that often is to be like very, like, the response of sort of being discriminated because of that. Your response as the person with that identity is to be like, well, I'm proud to be Black. I'm proud to be adaptive. I'm proud to be, this thing that I can't hide. And like that makes a lot of sense as a response, right? But I think sexuality specifically, I think being trans is like a different thing, right? But sexuality specifically is something that you can hide, right? Like you can, when I happen to be in Wyoming or Idaho, I can sort of modify how I am to come off more straight or more normative in some way. And I think it's both a blessing and a curse, right? On one hand, you can like sort of in a way keep yourself safe, or just keep yourself feeling safer and feeling more comfortable if you need to, kind of in any social situation. But then you also have this, you run into this issue where you're like, well, what does it look like if I'm not hiding it at all? And you don't know what that is. You haven't lived over a period of time where you're like always not hiding it in some way. And so you're going to get lost in like, well, what does it mean for me to be like fully open with being gay? Like, do I have to tell everyone that I'm gay the first thing that I meet them? Like, is that being fully open, or like, is it about being like, sort of talking in a certain way? Like, does that matter to me? Like, it's tricky. And I think it's just, maybe if there's one thing I leave with it is like almost every person that has a non-normative sexuality, I think, is struggling with this kind of like, what is really a quote unquote authentic expression of myself? Because we can hide it, and because it's so useful to be able to hide it, so we're always kind of playing along that spectrum of like, how much am I hiding it today? And like, maybe I just don't want that much attention today, or whatever it is, even if I'm in San Francisco. Right. And so because it's so hard to figure out, like sometimes you kind of end up coming off too strong in either direction, and it's just like, give us some grace for like every day we're like navigating this spectrum of like, how much do we do, and what is the right amount for myself. And sometimes you just kind of come out too strong, or like, I think there's a big reason why sort of gay pride is so loud and some people would say obnoxious, is because it's like, let's have at least a weekend where let's be the most gay we can be. So then at least we have some kind of like sort of milestones for like, okay, you can be like completely closeted and you can be like gay pride gay. And you're like, okay, now we can find ourselves somewhere in the middle of this, somewhere wherever we want to land on the spectrum. But it's like, you kind of need some goalposts on both ends a little bit. So anyways, it's a funny, it's a funny way to live.
I mean, it is, it's like I go at it from the same perspective when it's like I read your media and I looked and I'm like, okay, this, Thomas is going to be open to talk about this because it's part of what he does. He guides people. He's created these clinics and all this sort of thing. So it's like, but I've had, and the women, oftentimes I talk to women climbers about, is it important to you that you are, that you identify not as a woman, but like talk about women's issues. And some women climbers want to do that. And other ones, they're like, no, I just would rather be a climber. It's not really my thing to be pushing that kind of stuff. I get what you're saying about like, well, where is this person's position? Because I don't want to put anyone in. It's not like our place to be forcing anybody to take on a mantle of like activism that they don't necessarily want put on them. And I think within climbing, like that's been an interesting part of Black climbers since the Black Lives Matter movement. It's like they maybe don't want to talk about that today. They just sent some really sick project and that's what they want to talk about today. So I get what you're saying.
Yeah. I think everyone has a different journey here, obviously. I think I am maybe open or maybe even excited to talk about it because I feel like so many years I hid it in a way that wasn't like I wouldn't tell you I was gay, but like I kind of compartmentalized it and sort of put it, aside in so many different ways. And it's just it goes back to the classic thing of like it's so powerful to see someone that's like you doing something that you want to do, and like I just wouldn't want someone just getting into climbing now to like not see, oh yeah, there are gay climbers and like they struggle with some of the same things I struggle with too, and just driving back and forth between the Sierras and San Francisco constantly or whatever it is. So something that's so easy to hide and we're like programmed in some ways by society to hide it, I'm trying to kind of buck the trend a little bit, as much for everyone else as is for like just myself as well. So like I am more comfortable, talking about it and embodying it, rather than just kind of like, especially now not being in, in cities and in sort of queer communities as much, like that I don't forget as well, that I'm not kind of just like, all right, all I'm doing is just climbing and sleeping and then be like, oh, I forgot there's this whole side of me that is so easy. I'm so used to hiding from myself.
Well, let me ask you this real quick. We don't have to dwell upon it, but you're mentoring joking around a little bit too, but going to these places where you do find yourself hiding it. I mean, is that again something that you just do almost unconsciously, or are you encountering actual kind of threats or feelings of being threatened in some of these climbing places?
I've never had a negative, like an explicitly negative experience. I mean, because someone's like, oh, you're gay. And like, now I'm going to say this thing to you or whatever. Partly, I think I can claim that from, again, being like really good at hiding it and just almost subconsciously good at hiding it. Right. So I'm just kind of like, it's the assimilation happens automatically. But I'll never forget this one time I like pulled up to this gas station in Idaho and I like stepped out of the van and I had like my California plates, this big white van.
Yeah.
I was like,
well, see, that's a problem right there. Yeah.
There's that. Yeah. And then I step out, I have like pink hair and like these short shorts on and I'm just like, and then everyone's kind of looking at me and I'm like, maybe I'll go to a different gas station. It just felt fucking scary, And, but I've never had an explicit, I mean, I think I'm lucky to never have had an explicitly negative interaction. And yeah, and like I said, different kinds of identities have different, again, it's a blessing and a curse that, I think sexuality is something you can hide. So that gets you out of, I think, more explicit conflicts.
I'll go back to your climbing trajectory because one of the things that is unique about you is, you're in this alpinist space, although Jordan just invaded that. How did you get there from this like casual gym climber who'd climbed outside, who was living in San Francisco and ended up in Yosemite? But finally, I mean, an alpinist, you climb big peaks in Patagonia. It's part of your identity to do big routes. So tell me how that transpired.
I mean, it's kind of in a way, it's a very boring progression. Like my first season in Yosemite, I like went and climbed raw arches, it's like 16 pitch 5.7 and it took like 10 hours and I'll never forget, like I think Arnold and Dean Potter and Sean Leary just like soloed past all of us and I was just like, who are these people? But I sort of had a mini epic on raw arches like so many people do when they first start climbing the valley and first start doing long routes and first start doing long trad routes. And just over the years, I was like, okay, I'll do some. Now I start climbing 5.8, and I'm starting to climb 5.9, and just like slowly just built up, and now I'm like projecting 11A, and yeah, and it just it was a sort of a long, slow process. It feels like, I'm not trying to be overly humble when I say it, but like I don't feel like I have like a very natural talent for climbing per se. Like, I think I'm sure there's some talents there that I'm underappreciating, and I'm like underappreciating the privilege that gives me, but it's like, it just took a really, really long time to get to a place where it's like, oh, now I can just do El Cap in a day. It's like, I never even thought I would ever climb El Cap. It didn't seem possible. I think on the sort of more alpine side, it was also kind of really hard. Like I spent like many years trying to get into ice climbing. I kind of always thought I wanted to do like big white spiky peaks, partially because I just saw photos of that growing up in Hong Kong, and I was like, whoa, that looks cool. Like, let's go there. And I don't know. Ice climbing was like I was always had just a terrible time ice climbing. It was always too cold or too hot, and like the boots were so uncomfortable, and everything was just like really, really hard. And eventually, I think what I figured out was, sure, there's the climbing and sort of part of ice climbing that's a bit different than rock, but I also just didn't really know how to be in a cold place. So I ended up actually moving to Bozeman for 2 winters. And yes, I ice climbed a bunch, and that was really helpful, but it was equally as helpful, maybe more helpful, to just live in a place that was like, oh, you wake up and it's like -5 outside, and you're like, oh, okay, but I can still do stuff when it's -5 or whatever, or it snowed a foot overnight, and like just dealing with like snow and ice and cold temperatures and knowing how to manage that, like that was just as big of a learning as like, how do you swing an axe or things like that. So I think Patagonia was kind of a similar kind of just slow progression. Like I remember I bought Rollo's Patagonia book back in like 2014 or something like that when it first came out, and I like literally bought it just because I was like, oh, this would be a cool coffee table book. I'm never going to climb Patagonia, but I just kind of want to have the book. It's like the aspirational guidebook purchase. And 2 years ago, 2022, some of my Yosemite friends were going down. Ted Hesser had been down there at the point twice before. He was like interested in going down with me, and so we kind of just ended up. That whole thing ended up materializing. And I was like, oh, actually, like, I can climb Patagonia. Huh, who knew? It's generally been a process of like, wow, I'm really scared. And, well, I don't think I can do that, but I guess we can give it a try. And, it most of the time working out decently and being like, oh, okay, well, I guess I can try again and do way better the next time. Because now like we said before, like, now mentally I know I can do it. So much of it was held back by like, oh, I don't think I can do that. Oh, I'm not someone who can climb in Patagonia. Oh, I'm not this and that. So it's a very long process.
I was thinking about when we were talking earlier too about Mission Cliffs, and you said I had my gay life, my professional life, my climbing life, but then it occurred to me that gym, it's very, very early gym. It's been this kind of touchstone for so many people who've created climbing lives for themselves, whatever it happens to be. Now I just realized that it's probably been this crazy bridge between the gay community and the climbing community, like long before we were talking about these issues, where it is and what it's doing. I mean, did you find like those two worlds so different, or, what was it like to kind of hop between the climbing community and the other community? And I'll say this other thing too, is I have a really good friend I climbed with for years, and he's this former ski patroller and ski competitor, and then he was this incredible climber, like big beard, like classic mountain dude, and his sister or his brother-in-law was in, not gay but in fashion, and he was in LA, and when he would go visit, like all of him and all of his friends would call my buddy Grizzle Adams, not Grizzly Adams, just Grizzle Adams, because he would show up and they were all fascinated by his life in the mountains and like this like dirtbag, former deadhead, like bearded dude. So it does seem like, at least if not the climbing gym, but it seems like the lifestyle, you're living in a van and stuff, doesn't necessarily compute with like the typical image of like a San Francisco gay community. So is there like kind of like a
totally
mishmash there?
Yeah. Well, people just don't understand. They're like, so what do you do? Like, so you go climbing, like, I mean, the joke was always like, I would go, go off on a weekend in Yosemite and do whatever, and then I come back and my gay friends would be like, oh, how was your hike? And I was like, yeah, hike was great. I think gay culture in general, at least in the US, is not very outdoorsy. And so it's not that different from maybe like talking to your parents or just talking to you, like, if you have like a regular white collar job in a city or something and talking to those friends, and they're kind of like, what do you do? You're climbing all the time. And like, they just don't, it's hard for them to understand, even though climbing is getting so much more mainstream, it's still like, well, it's not like, they're like, oh, I've gone bouldering once in the gym. And it's like, oh, it's not quite the same thing as like climbing El Cap in a day. Like, it's hard to like bridge like what difference between those two things are. It's like, yeah, it's, I don't know. I think climbing is, despite being more mainstream, I think it's still quite a weird thing to do. Like, it's, and you're going to find, I think we're just going to find that a lot of folks are like, they don't understand it. And they kind of like, are like, oh, like, this is just a thing that seems very so far outside of most people's, understanding. And there's still a little bit of countercultural vibes left in climbing,
So you, are becoming, you're some level of certified guide. Are you working?
Yeah, I just passed my rock guide exam. So I'm a certified rock guide now. Yeah.
Nice. Awesome. I mean, are you going to go all the way to the IFMGA kind of thing? Is that in your brain? Or
Lord.
Or is this more of a way to get trained up to work on your diversity programs?
That to a certain extent. I think yeah. It's the same kind of things around visibility, around kind of being someone who can be like, hey, look, there are gay rock guides, there are queer rock guides, and you can do that too. Like, and that's a part of my motivation too. I think it's also, I really enjoy guiding and instructing, like, sort of affinity groups or not. It's just like, it's really fun to see someone do something that like half an hour ago, they're like, oh, I can't do that. Kind of in a similar, sort of mirrors my own experiences and my own. So the first time I saw snow, I was 17 in Norway. And I don't know, like, I've always been a really crap skier. And, I don't know. I don't know if the skiing thing is going to work out for me. But so this kind of puts the IFMGA thing a little bit far away. But I think I'm stoked to get the rock thing done. Yeah, maybe I'll do the alpine track at some point, and maybe at some point I'll figure out how to ski. But I don't know. It's so different from climbing. Climbing, you're like in so much control, and you like think about what you're going to do. And skiing, you just got to not think about it. And I'm just like, it's very scary.
Yeah, I do ski, but it's a much more natural act for me to climb because it's slower.
Yeah, exactly.
And skiing, it takes me a ton more concentration.
Yeah.
Well, moving towards that, doing these affinity group classes, clinics, and things like that. Tell us about that. You kind of just talked about it, and I think it's pretty obvious, this idea of having examples in the community that are like you, and you can look up to if that's not quite the right way to look at it, but why is like, well, let me say this, like the pushback, or not really the pushback, but like the people who don't think about this too much are like, why anybody can go climbing. Like, well, there's not like literally a gate, you can go and buy some shoes and go climbing. No one's stopping you, kind of a thing.
Right. Totally.
But the people who push diversity have a lot of arguments as to why it's important. So maybe give us your spiel, and also I'd like to hear what your pitch is to get people to come to these clinics from that community.
Yeah. I mean, it's true. I think in that way, climbing, I think, and in some ways, sports in general,
or the outdoors.
The outdoors is not very non-discriminatory, right? So anyone can like go hiking and go buy a pair of shoes and go climbing and things like that. But at the end of the day, it's like, yes, that's really nice. But we're social creatures, right? We're like, oh, well, who are these other climbers? Who are these other hikers? And so on and so forth. And we want to relate to people, that do the same things as we do, whatever it is that we do. And what does it mean to relate to someone, right? It's like, okay, they share some kind of, they share some values maybe, but often it's that they share like a lived experience, right? Like, I mean, I feel like we're probably, all of us have memories of like the first time you like get down from something, you just started climbing, you get down from a climb and you like talk to someone else and they're like, oh, I climbed that too. And yeah, oh, like it's such a weird move right there. And you're like all gesturing in midair and looking really funny. You're talking about, oh, that cam placement. And like, that's like a shared lived experience, right? You both lived like climbing through that crux or whatever it is. And I think in that same way, like, this whole drive for like affinity programs is really in a way to be like, hey, like it'll be really nice to go hang out with other people that share your same lived experiences, be it like because of race or gender or sexuality or whatever it is. And it can be really hard to find people like, that share those lived experiences, right? I think it's just sometimes it's a very narrow event. I mean, there's still not that many gay climbers that are like sort of semi-professional or public about it. There's just like everyone's like, oh, there's Jordan, okay, and then there's like me, and I'm like, cool. Oh, Madeline Sorkin is queer, right? Cool, we got that. Oh, Laura's okay. You know, it's like this is not like it's like hard to cut. The list is really short, and so
it's fully like
yeah,
that.
right? Yeah, and so it's like, and every and I'm sure like last couple of years, all the brands like, oh wait, how many black athletes do we have? Oh god, we got to find more black athletes. Anyways, so yeah, it's. I mean, that's really all there's to it. It's just finding in the same way that you like. It's so fun when you find someone who's climbed the route you've climbed, and you can like geek out about the route you have both climbed, and the moves on it. It's the same way that you can find someone who's like, oh, like they understand where I'm coming from. Like they can understand like I for a long time felt so alone in this like, oh, I'll be in San Francisco and have FOMO for the mountains, and I'll be like in the Sierra and have FOMO for San Francisco. And I'm just like, wow, this is like kind of a torturous process. And it turns out that's a really common experience. Like a lot of my, queer friends who climb have that same kind of dichotomy of like, oh God, I want to be in both places at the same time, and it's really nice to be able to share that with someone else. Because climbing isn't just about the climbing, right? For most of us. And so that's why it's nice. It's just hang out with people who understand you. That's really all there is to it.
So what's your pitch? I mean, it's
like why
is it the same? Yeah, like you've got again, you've sort of I don't know, it's stereotypical, but there's like you said, it doesn't seem to the gay community doesn't seem to have a huge crossover to hardcore things in the outdoors. So yeah, what's your sort of pitch as to why someone should join it? The other thing I would say that's a little bit, I think, and you can disagree with me, is that crossing into new communities for certain groups, there has been and there can be it can be very threatening and very literally threatening to feel like you can walk into a group of if you're black and this is a mostly white sport. Maybe it's not real when you get there. You find out there wasn't a real fear, but you certainly have those fears. And I think the threat of violence towards gay people is common, and so I think crossing into new groups that you don't necessarily understand, even if you have a desire, and also like leaving the comfort of what it takes a lot of courage, and it takes a lot of it takes someone to convince them that it's going to be okay. So I guess that's kind of like loaded, and it's not quite as simple as like, oh, I just want to try climbing, when you're talking about certain groups.
It's like it's always scary trying new things, whatever it is, right? Scary trying
but there's sports. Like this extra layer to it, when you have
there's this extra layer to it as well.
Yeah,
for sure. And that's the pitch. I mean, I think you said it earlier, right? That's the pitch for the affinity groups. It's like, I think the way I think about it, or the way I like to tell people about it, I guess, is like, I mean, climbing has completely changed my life, right? Like for me, it is such an incredibly magical and amazing thing. And I would love for more people to experience it. And it's always hard to try new things. So if there's a way to try something new where, it's with people who, will understand other parts of your life, other parts of your other identities you have, that makes it a little easier, because it's always going to be scary the first time you go climbing. It's always going to be scary to sort of walk into a gym, or like go to a meetup, or like go to a clinic, or whatever it is. So within the climbing world, I think that's kind of the pitch. I think like in a broader sense, in the broader society in the US and in general across the world, there's a lot more sort of societal discrimination and things, and much worse things. But like, at least in climbing and in just the little world of affinity programming in climbing, it's like, hey, we're just trying to make it easier for people to go climbing.
We started out with talking about your climbing, and it's evolved as it always does. And you think you're on sort of a normie, boring path with your climbing, that it seems like, well, I just, climbed what everybody else climbed and just kept going. So what are your sort of, what are your dreams, and how has your attitude towards climbing evolved over the last few years? I know like part of your evolution is encountering some tragedy in the mountains that you will when you're an alpinist. And from what I've heard and read, you sound pretty eyes wide open about that as well. But you talked about this like childlike love that you had for it, and maybe still have for it. But Talk a little bit about your sort of climbing dreams and the evolution of the way you look at it a little bit.
Yeah, I think more than anything else, I want to be able to climb for as long as possible. So part of that is staying alive. Can't climb when you're dead. But also just like, I guess I think a lot more about longevity now, right? It's like, I just think more about like, well, this is something that I can do this next season or 5 seasons from now. And like, there's a natural tapering, I think, as you get older in terms of like, sort of what you can climb or how ambitious one can be. But I wouldn't want to lose. I would prefer not to lose, this thing in my life that I do still have a childlike wonder for. And I still am like, I'm sure lots of other people feel as well. Like, sometimes I'm like having a terrible day, or I just like woke up weird. I'm just really tired. Everything feels kind of weird. And then, I'm just like, oh God, maybe I should bail. And I just go. But eventually I managed to like get to the bit where I'm actually climbing. And I'm like, okay, now I feel a lot better. And it's just like the climbing movement feels so good in my body. I just would really want to not lose that in lots of different ways. I mean, even lose it in terms of like somehow making climbing not fun for me, or making climbing too competitive, or whatever it is. I think probably my big hopes and dreams are, I think I would love to climb some big spiky white peaks, those. I think that's what I've always wanted to do. But I spent so long being like, well, I just don't know. There's so many skills and gear and things, and just sort of in the way of being like, oh, now you'll climb 6,000 or 7,000 meter peak. It's like, that seems so far away that like now it feels more and more possible. And I would love to get into some of that stuff. And that's partially why I kind of have leaned more into alpine climbing in the last couple years. And kind of almost like really a orthogonal direction of that is like, I've also been climbing long enough now that I would love to like, I think I'd love to try and climb a little harder. I've never been super grade chasey. I think I've never really like trained that much, and I've never like in terms of like climbing training anyway. And I've always just kind of been like, okay, well, I'll train just by climbing a ton. And like that works for so long, but at some point you hit kind of a plateau where you're like, okay, I can climb a bunch more. But like, I mean, I've done so many like 10 pitch 511s, and I can do 10 pitch 511s for the rest of my life. But I'm like, oh, there's probably more to climbing than that, right? Where it's like, I can climb things that are like harder or take a few more tries to send. And like, I feel like there's a whole world there where I haven't really explored that much. And I'd love to try and get into that a little bit more and be like, okay, like, and part of that is also just like big wall free climbing. It's like, okay, can I like climb 513 on day 5 on the side of a big wall? It's like, that's something that I haven't done that much of as well. But those are, I recognize those are very orthogonal desires, like climbing harder and then doing like high altitude, big white spiky mountains are like kind of, but we'll see what happens.
Have you ever thought, or maybe you've gone back or thought about your Chinese roots and wondered about dipping into China to climb in that climbing community?
Yeah, I've thought about it for sure. Yeah, I think it feels like China's kind of after so many decades of like opening up more, it seems like it's closing back in a little bit more right now.
What dialect did you speak? Did you say?
Yeah,
Cantonese.
So yeah, which is not Mandarin, which is what most folks.
You still got that under
Cantonese? I still got. Yeah, I think it
under control.
It takes a little time for it to kind of come back, but it's still there. I learned a little Mandarin growing up. I was never very good at languages or Mandarin, but I feel like I could probably pick up Mandarin fairly easily with my Cantonese background. But yeah, I would love to climb more in China. It's kind of the opposite situation to most Americans, right? Like a lot of Americans are like, oh, I'd love to go climb in like the Middle East or like, China, or like sort of these far-flung places I've heard about so much, looked at on a globe, in elementary school, and but like I'm already there. Like the US was the place I looked on the globe in elementary school, being like, where's that? And oh look, they have this thing called Yosemite over there. And so like so I'm pretty happy climbing the US still is something that's like, I'm like, wow, I can't believe I get to climb here. And I can't believe like, I grew up on the other side of the world, and like now I live in a van driving around the US. And all that said, China, I mean, it would be amazing to climb China. There's like, I feel like there's a lot of potential development there. My understanding is that there's like a really strong climbing community over there. And I think like climbing communities that are like a little bit disconnected from like the sort of Western, like alpinism, like American climbing sort of hegemony, like they're kind of dying for some more connection with, other climbers from different places. and just exposures to like different styles and different, techniques and all that kind of stuff. I would love to go climb over there. It would be really cool. And I think it would feel like, even climbing in like Pakistan, I'm like, oh, like these people are a little bit more like me. Like there's just their mannerisms, and they kind of, there's almost a nostalgia there. And I think that would be also kind of a really amazing feeling to kind of, in a way, go home and climb, even climb in Hong Kong more. Like there's pretty good climbing in Hong Kong. So
it'd be ridiculous though, is that if you were somewhere and rocked up with a bunch of North Face athletes or whatever, and then your whole story about the lady at the McDonald's like not expecting you to spit candies. I mean, that would like blow some freaking minds if you rocked up with a big group of those people, and then all of a sudden you could start conversing.
They would be like,
people
what's
would freak
happening?
out.
Especially if I show
super
with pink
amazing
hair.
actually.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, totally. Just like halfway through the conversation. Wait, like hold out just a little bit, try to communicate
and then
with like broken English, and then just be like, yeah, dude, I can totally speak Cantonese. You would be a hero. Like they would have a parade for you.
They would be psyched. Yeah, it would be pretty fun. Yeah. No, I think it would be cool. Yeah, it would be really cool to climb over there. I've literally never climbed in China, so it would be like it would just be, and they have it all. They have big spiky white peaks. They have like really hard single pitch climbing. They have really hard trad climbing. It's a big country. They've got it all. So
awesome. Do we miss anything?
I think I'm contractually obliged to plug that a friend and I have been working on a new guidebook to Tuolumne Meadows, the high country in Yosemite. Yeah, and the book comes out in spring next year. The goal is to get it out before the pass opens, as always. But you can pre-order it now you can Google for it. But it's like the website's like tuolumne.guide. It's like, but does anyone know how to spell Tuolumne though? Anyways, you can figure it out. But
troubling.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. No wonder that domain was available. But yeah, so go pre-order the book if you're stoked. Yeah, Robin's been working on it for like 12 years, and I sort of joined in.
Who are you working on it
with? This guy Robin Hirsch. He's classically trained as a botanist, but he's spent a lot of time in Tuolumne most of his life, and yeah, I joined up maybe like 4 or 5 years ago, kind of more helping with the production side of things. But yeah, we've poured our heart and soul into this book, so we're hoping to kind of it's such an amazing place to climb, and like almost no one ever climbs there, relative to Nutcracker in the valley. So yeah, we're really stoked to get this book out.
All right, folks, thanks for listening, and thanks to Thomas for connecting from the van in Yosemite. He's been having an amazing season down in Patagonia, last time I checked. It's a great post up on his Instagram about climbing Cerro Chalten. Pretty epic. He's graduated, for sure. So follow him on Instagram at NeoDude to find out what he's up to. Okay, don't forget also to leave a voicemail. 1-888-532-9822. 1-888-532-9822. It's also on the website. Go over there. Leave a voicemail. Leave a TAPS voicemail, but also just leave a voicemail. I'm only going to have this 800 number for about a month. So use it and abuse it. Sing me a song. Read a poem. Insult me. Tell me I suck. I don't care. It's there for your use. Okay, it's snowy, cold in Colorado. Ice climbers are psyched. Skiers are psyched. People who want to drink water and live are psyched. I hope you're psyched too. And I hope you check your knots.
Laughing heart. Your life is your life. Don't let it be clubbed into dank submission. Be on the watch. There are ways out. There is light somewhere. It may not be much light, but it beats the darkness. Be on the watch. The gods will offer you chances. Know them and take them. You can't beat death, but you can beat death in life. Sometimes the more often you learn to do it, the more light there will be. Your life is your life. Know it while you have it. You are marvelous. And the gods wait to delight in you.